Jonathan Potter here, and today we are going to be replacing our sunroof running gear on an '89 Toyota Corolla GTS. When I bought the car, the back, one of the corners wasn't pulling up all the way, and when I went in to fix it, actually one of the carriers was detached from the cable. So what I'm going to show you is how to take out the sunroof, pull out the entire track, and clean it, and we'll put some used but fixed cables in there.
All said and told, this project took maybe 4 hours. Actual on-the-car time was probably about 2.5 hours. The amount of time spent cleaning and making sure everything was good to go for the install, maybe about 1.5 hours or so.
This is the extent of the tools you will need to change your sunroof track, or to reseal your sunroof, or even to replace your sunroof motor. 10mm socket, you don't necessarily need it, but it makes life a heck of a lot easier. 10mm box wrench, big flathead, and a little Phillips head. I also used an impact gun to get one of the screws out. You may or may not need that. It sort of depends. And a little bit of light. Alright, so when we talk about the sunroof running gear, this is essentially what we're discussing. What we have is the carriers at the back of the cables, which will eventually run through this track here, the cables and the carriers. The front carriers, which are only attached to the sunroof top themselves. This front cable guide, which has some guides underneath, and the motor. The motor mounts down underneath in the headliner and then attaches up in there. I'm actually not going to replace the motor on mine, but I have an extra one just in case. And the way that these things work is that the cables run through both sides on this long track. Here we are inside the car, and I actually had my sunroof out a little while ago. What the factory manual suggests to get started is back it up about halfway, and then you can pop your headliner off. Basically, the headliner just snaps into these holes here, so you need to back it out a little bit, and then you can just pry it down and it'll pop off. But since I've already had mine off before, what we're going to do is just go ahead and push that back, and this is where we're going to focus our efforts to begin. We've got the carrier at the back, like we saw, and then the carrier at the front. So we're going to undo these 10mm bolts. There are spacers in here, and I would suggest that you keep track of where those spacers are. So you can see the silver plate right above the carrier right there, and making sure that the spacers are in there correctly when you put it back together, because those define the alignment. So you can see there's a spacer in the front as well. Alright, so here we are. We've got our bolts taken out, and sunroof is ready to go. We're going to push the front up, and then the back actually just sort of slides forward a little bit. And we've got the roof out. We've got the roof out. Here's the view from the top, and you can see what we were talking about before. We've got our front carrier, our back carrier. This is the windscreen piece that pops up when it backs out, and underneath there is our front track piece. So the next thing we're going to need to do is actually remove this trim from around the inside.
I accidentally turned the camera off when I was recording. What we missed was there are 4 bolts for the windscreen, 2 in the front underneath the windscreen and 2 at the back. Remove the back ones first, remove the front ones second, and then...
So there we go, we've got those bolts out. Take these back ones out first so you can access the front, and then the whole piece. We'll just lift right out. There we go. So now we can see all the other screws that we've got to take out. We've got one right there that's accessible underneath the headliner, one back there. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. This flat panhead screw actually just holds the running gear together. And then 5, another one underneath the headliner, and then finally back there makes 6. Some of these are awful tight, and so sometimes I like to use an impact gun. In this case, we might actually need to release the motor from the drive gear so that we can actually slide this carrier piece back just a little bit. Basically, we took that headliner piece out from around here, and now there's our 10mm bolt. The motor is right underneath here, and actually we just need to pry this piece of trim off. So underneath here you can see we've got one screw holding it in place and two screws holding it in place. So those guys are going to come out and the motor assembly is going to be underneath here. There it is. If you ever run into a situation where you can't close your sunroof or the motor's burned out or something, what the manual says to do is use a great big screwdriver on this screw right there and you'll be able to manually drive it, although it's insanely heavy and the drag on the motor is really high. So, you know, we've got that cover off. You can see we've got a bolt here, which is towards the back of the vehicle on this side, and then another bolt here. They're both 10mm bolts, so you can either pull it down and get them started from this direction, or you can kind of try and get an extension up that way. But you will end up wallowing out your headliner piece just a little bit if you use an extension. You have to take those two bolts out and disengage the motor because they are actually bolted to track right there. And now this is about ready to come out, but it's got some really thick weather stripping along the front here and along all the sides of the track. So we need to carefully pry it up and make sure that we don't bend this very thin piece of sheet metal underneath here. So there we go. We've got everything unbolted and the track is all ready to come out. So just lift it up and out, and it's going to bring the headliner with it. You can slide that up. So this is what it looks like underneath that track piece. Now we've got all that out, disassembled. We're going to clean this all up so that we can reseal it with some silicone sealant.
So here are the cables and carriers from the junkyard track that I purchased, and you can see these things are 25 years old, and so the plastic is already starting to break on these as well. So what we're going to do is mend that joint there between the cable and the carrier itself, and we're just going to use a little bit of Gorilla super glue. Hopefully that won't break down the plastic too much and will last, you know, at least a few years.
So here you go. The next day we used some Gorilla Glue and it's looking much better. And in fact, one of the leads actually snapped off while I was cleaning it. So the Gorilla Super Glue hopefully will hold for us. Alright, so we've got this thing almost back together. We went ahead and lubricated in the tracks here on both sides. And actually those carriers that I showed you that I fixed, some of the glue was a little bit too thick on them, and so I actually ended up taking a hacksaw blade and filing down the joint just a little bit so that it would fit into this channel here. The lubricant that I used was a dry lube. I did some research and thought that, you know, this seems like it probably makes the most sense for this application. Some people said grease, some people said bicycle chain lube. This probably makes the most sense because it's dust free and it's not going to attract dirt. So hopefully it works out okay. And now basically it's just a matter of, we're going to slide these cables up into the cable carrier and bolt it all back together. Okay, so this is actually where I'm going to do some things a little bit different from normal. I am going to use an RTV silicone sealant instead of black rubber weather stripping, because I've used this stuff a ton and I know that it works really well, and I know especially that it doesn't get all gummy on the bottom side of parts. So this will be really easy. What we're going to do is, or for all these little pieces here, we're going to just put a little bit of drop in there, make sure that nothing gets inside the body, and then we're also going to run a bead along this front part and make sure that that lines up really well with our track. Okay, so you can see what I did here. I actually put a double line of silicone sealant all the way down and across the whole thing. That should take care of pretty much all the sealant issues. So we've got it all back in. We've just got to put the bolts in from underneath the headliner. Make sure that you put the headliner piece for the sunroof in prior to bolting it down. I'm a moron and forgot, and this was really hard to get in there, and I actually broke the back of it a little bit. So basically at this point all we've got to do is do the bolt under there, under the headliner, back underneath here under the headliner and reattach the motor, and then we'll be ready to and make sure that it's all aligned properly.
So to line this all up without actually having the roof attached to it, make sure that you slide the front carriers as far forward as they'll go, and the back carriers have a small hole in the rear of them that needs to line up with the screw hole in the track. If you get that all lined up ahead of time, once you re-engage the motor drive gear, both of the rear carriers will be locked into place so that they won't move fore and aft.
Alright, so we got it all bolted back in. It is in the up closed position. And, you know, the factory manual actually says to put this back together on the track and then slide it in. But we're trying it this way. We'll see how we did. It's all closed up fairly well. Maybe not perfect. I might need a bit of adjustment, but let's see if it... Oh yeah. So the issue that I was originally having was this rear corner wasn't popping up and it leaked a little bit. So now you can kind of see, it's getting a little bit dark at this point, but there's a little bit of a gap here still, but there's probably enough of a seal there that we should be okay. So you can see the problem I was originally having is that piece that's popped up in the back right there on that hinge wasn't hinging up. So what was happening is my corner was staying down, and you can see, or when we open it, I'm sorry, it hinges down, and then when we close it up, you can see it popped up like that. So that little hinge piece right there can be the key to a leaking or dry sunroof. Alright, so now we're looking up at the top, and the last thing we're going to do is slide our cover forward, and we're actually going to back the sunroof out just a little bit. You can see we've got these little holes right there. This is going to pull forward, snap right back into place. Alright, there you go. We got a new sunroof track installed, sealed up, lubed up, and fixed some things. It's great. So if anything goes wrong with this install, I will be sure to let you know in the comments or in an additional video. But until then, keep working on your own projects and keep your own car running. Thanks.